Start recording. And go.
Hello, you've joined on Second Thought with Mike and Luke. We are two entrepreneurs of thought who love to explore and wrestle with the underlying connections and meanings of ideas, culture, politics, relationships, learning, and faith. As we strive to understand our world, we invite you to think again about what's true and to step back into your world with refined purpose and renewed hope. Today we're going to explore the role of reason in life and progressivism and whatnot, and something about the culture of death. We're going to talk a little bit about pastors and activism and have some thoughts on sorrow. How you doing this afternoon, Luke?
I'm doing good.
Doing well?
Yeah. Had a busy morning.
Yeah.
Went doing some handyman projects.
Nice.
Kind of spur of the moment. Somebody reached out on Facebook, and so it actually was fun taking my oldest son and sort of teaching him how to swing a hammer and think about buildings and that sort of thing. So
yeah, good. So I heard you something piqued your curiosity about The Handmaid's Tale.
Well, not The Handmaid's Tale specifically. There's this. I don't know if you're familiar with the story of The Handmaid's Tale.
A little bit.
Okay.
I'm not enough to have watched it.
No, right. I'm familiar with it enough to not have watched it.
I know where it's going, and so it's like, okay.
It's sort of this laughable take on where conservatism would go if left unchecked.
Yeah.
That it would end up with women being commodities, specifically regarding their controlling their ability to give birth.
Yeah.
Right, and that wealthy men would take women as servants.
Which is funny, it's a politicized redo of the Stepford Wives. Right.
But what I was thinking about, I watch with interest the whole dynamic of how the LGBTQ2 plus how that whole thing functions in society. And one of the things I've noticed is that the only people on current culture who are commoditizing birth are gay men who are paying for women to have babies for them in this way that, in fact, I've heard of a couple different stories of they back out midway and then this woman has a baby that she then gets a late-term abortion even, right? And that the culture of that movement kind of throws off all the restraints.
Oh, you're talking about the real commodifiers.
That a woman's womb is for sale.
Yeah.
And so that sort of bothers me on an interesting level. But it also kind of brings up this James Lindsay. I don't know if you know him. He's a professor who has come out. He's against sort of the woke mindset. And he talks about the iron law of woke projection. And I know people have opinions.
Just going to ask you about projection, what you thought.
Yeah. But the idea being that whatever you hear the most extreme people saying that we're doing, there must be doing it. Yeah. And I've noticed this in my relationships with people, kids who struggle. But
talking about in school.
In schools, in my education life. Yeah. That if someone only cares about being liked, then they will accuse others of only caring about being liked.
Yes, right.
They see in others the motive that they themselves maybe even resent.
Yes.
Or see as a weakness, but they can't overcome it, and then it becomes resentment toward others.
Yep. Right. I noticed when I was pastoring, it's always a certain person who accuses others of pride.
Right, yeah.
It's always the same kind of person. Hint, hint.
Right. So now you had a quick take.
Wait. I'm going to go back one more thing on your thing. Yeah. I know these are supposed to be fast, huh? But projection. Do you think everybody does that to some degree?
Oh,
do you think we all do it? Do you really?
Yeah. Every. Is
there that different than a strategic, intentional doing it in order to mute your opponent?
Well, that's when you get into like gaslighting and psychopathy and deeper levels of dysfunction and
psyops wars, man.
Right. Which Twitter is now becoming more and more clear that it was.
Collusion with Russia.
Right, yeah. But I just think, okay, Twitter's just the one we know about.
I know.
Yeah.
I know. But it is a part of warfare. I've thought a lot about this, especially in the political realm, where if you're successful even if you're not successful at landing the accusation, you've diluted the waters. So when it comes out, some evidence against you, when they say, well, you're doing this, now it sounds like tit for tat.
Yeah.
You've weakened the accusation capacity toward yourself if you know you're guilty.
Right.
It's very successful. It's very hard.
Even if you realize that maybe someone on your side does that too, right? It's the classic, but that's the classic little kid, like, he hit me back.
It is. It is.
But it doesn't. If you're going to handle it as an adult, you would say, we'll deal with that separately.
Yeah.
And resolve the issue at hand.
Yeah.
But it feels like there's very few adults engaged in
there's
what's
somebody
going
who
on.
got mad at me for something recently, and I haven't spoken to them or haven't seen them recently, and I was thinking about it, and you know what I found myself thinking of is the way to defend myself was to ask them if they're mad at somebody else for the same thing and try to show their hypocrisy instead of address why they're mad at me.
Right.
It's diluting the argument by spreading guilt around, and therefore it's not going to maybe potentially land on me if I'm guilty or not, you know.
So is that a defense technique, or is it
I know, that's what
genuine, curious response to the way they handled it?
I'm just saying, I think you're right. I think there is some defensiveness at root. So anyway, okay.
I'll say in my experience, trying to psychoanalyze people that are mad at you never works very well.
Yeah, probably you don't have great
At
filters
least not
too.
to their face in the moment. Yeah.
Well, something I saw interesting recently that I just thought made me curious was the Democrats moved their primaries to South Carolina from Iowa.
Right.
And when I saw it for a few days, and the first few days I thought, why? What in the world's going on? And this nagging sense that there's some reason for it. I just don't know what it is. And then it struck me, I have a theory as to why.
Okay.
And I just thought it was interesting. You can tell me what you think about it. But I thought the primaries are different. In Iowa, you have to contend all over the place. However many candidates there are, you have to fight. In fact, last year, I don't really know if you remember, it was a horrid nightmare because Bernie Sanders won and they didn't want him to win.
Last go round.
Last year, 2020, yeah.
Yeah.
And they muddled the waters, and there was tons of cheating, and they just threw it all out. It was so convoluted. Mm-hmm. But the reason it was because everyone contends. In South Carolina...
Well, also because Iowa's not a primary.
No, this was a primary for the Democrats.
But Iowa's a caucus. It's not a primary.
What do you mean?
So they go into an arena, and they caucus. So they send their delegates, and they vote on the floor of the arena, and if no one is clear winner, then the delegates...
Okay.
It's this big process.
Okay.
It's not like you would think of as an election.
Right.
Iowa's really unique.
Okay. Well, in South Carolina, my understanding is it's control. The party chair has control over who gets to be put up in front of the voters to say, yeah, we want him to be our candidate.
Wait, that's the rule where?
In South Carolina.
Oh my gosh.
So what that does is it clears the room for who they want to be up front is the first state to get. They want their leading man, whoever that's going to be, to be... Or woman, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's another curious thing we should ask some point. Question would be, do you think Michelle Obama is going to run for president?
Well, I think it would be a great thumb in the eye of Hillary Clinton that the first woman president would be an Obama.
Yeah.
My understanding is they weren't exactly friends.
Oh, I can't think that they were.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting question. Okay. All right. Hey, let's do something different here.
Okay.
Comments, things you've been thinking about, things you have some thoughts about culture of death. What are they? I'd love to hear. I'm interested to hear what you're thinking here.
So I put stuff out on Facebook on a regular basis, right?
Okay.
And some of those things spark conversation.
And I don't.
Yeah.
On a regular basis.
That'd be interesting to talk about. Mm-hmm. Where are you on all that?
Yeah.
Yeah. But my goal is always on there is to spark conversation and be thought provoking. And so I put something out about something I've noticed. So when I was a kid, I had this sense of like it would not be right for me to wear clothes that had skulls on them.
Okay.
I don't know if this was because I came from a conservative Christian family, or if it was something more broad in our culture.
Yeah.
That at the time it was somewhat taboo
To celebrate.
to celebrate death or to identify yourself with death.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But as I think of the clothes that I looked at in the stores, it was quite rare that you'd see shirts with skulls or other things.
Yeah.
But that's completely reversed now.
Yeah.
And I posted something about it, about how, our culture has become more and more focused on death. Just recently, the leading cause of death I read in Canada currently is physician-assisted suicide. But even if you don't have a doctor helping you, suicide is incredibly rising, right?
Yeah.
And I remember this quote from, it might have been the Taliban, it might have been ISIS, some terrorist organization fighting against U.S. armed forces. And their line was, you're a culture of life and we're a culture of death.
That's the Taliban said
that? The Taliban said that we want to die. And because you're so worried about dying.
The Taliban says
of themselves that they are a culture of death.
So they'll embrace it.
They're willing to die for it. Right.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
And America is running around at all costs to save lives.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay.
But what I see is that's changing.
Yes.
With abortion becoming more, not just, abortion's been around forever. And the number of abortions is somewhat going down. But Oprah, celebrated, fight
jump up and shout for your abortion.
Right. Holy cow. But I see that also in these cultural symbols. And I'm becoming more and more convinced that the symbols that we connect with have deeper meaning than we might give them.
Yeah.
Right. So, I have this whole, I've been pondering, and I don't actually know what I think of this, but I've noticed in the last 20 years or even less that like dragons as protagonists have become really, really common in children's media.
Yeah. They become the good guys.
Right. And like you could have a dragon as a pet, or these dragons are wild, but you could tame them.
Yeah,
the idea of like the death and destruction as a normal part of our culture.
Yeah.
And so I'm just saying I'm not going to do that anymore.
Yeah.
Like and
well, it's the same with other areas. With like movies, it used to be clear they're black and white, good guy, bad guy, and the plot that was. But now the best movies are bad guy can be good at heart, and he does bad, or the good guy is bad. That's the whole Departed with the cop movie. The bad guy is really an undercover cop, and the guy on the force is really a mob person. Right. And so, but the reality is, the defense of that is the grayness. There is grayness. There is moral grayness.
Well, and I think that is an adult way
not necessarily the
to look at reality.
Should be.
Like, so I remember being surprised once reading a description without names of Hitler, Stalin, and Churchill. But I think it was Hitler and Churchill were sort of put as contrasts. And it was written to a Christian audience. It was the time when I was a school teacher at a Christian school. And it talked about, one of them was really health focused and regimented and vegetarian and wanted things, upstanding focus on morality.
Ordered.
And the other one was smoking and drinking and up all hours and
Yeah.
And then you find that Hitler was the one who fit what you think of as the traditionally conservative, right? We talked about this last time. Not necessarily politically conservative.
Yeah.
But it does make sense that the traditionalist authoritarian is the definition of fascism, right? It's the traditional conservative politically meeting with the authoritarian impulse.
Well, we'll have to do that another time because I think you need to explain that more.
Yeah, sure. So. Okay. But anyway, that's the culture of death, the idea that I wonder too if this is part of our, so many people are talking about, is our country going to rip in two? Mm-hmm. Is there going to be a war of some kind? And so when you start to think about that, you start thinking about death as a more real part of life, which traditionally it is. Mm-hmm. If I was reading Jonathan Edwards, and like half of his siblings growing up had died before the age of 5, and so to an 18, 19-year-old who's seen 5 of his siblings die, death is normal. It's ever present. But our culture, like even our old people die somewhere else.
Okay, so when you're saying it's normal, what do you mean? What's the implication of saying it that way? That is normal, meaning that
they have to face the reality of death and the evil that it is.
Yes, okay, that's what I thought you meant.
Whereas
not
what we
normal
have
in the good sense, but normal that it's not fun. Don't in other words, like war. Oh, we play war, but when you're in one, it's not really playing anymore. That's not fun.
Yes, that's right. Well, and that's part of it too. Is that this death symbolism? It's coming from or appealing to people who've never really experienced much death.
Yeah. Yes. That's what. Yeah, that's what I thought you were getting at. Yeah, that is interesting. What do you think about the dynamic of death? But you're really talking about symbols of things that are dire. Death being, of course, the biggest. But you also have other symbols, just black.
Yeah.
But what do you think about the segment of the population that is wearing those symbols, connecting with them because they feel awful? or
right, symbols of
mourning, sorrow, and maybe even a rejection of everything's not okay.
Right.
Don't tell me it's okay.
You're just Johnny Cash right now, is what you're saying. That's what I hear you
A
describe.
little bit. I guess I suppose that's fair.
Yeah.
I wasn't trying to go there, but I guess, taking off on that. Well, I just remember interacting with a young lady for a season of her life that was difficult for her, and she had difficulties. And as I tried to hear her and help her, but a lot of it is trying to hear where somebody's coming from, I realized some of what they're struggling with is because this person was an incredibly empathic person.
Okay.
And she felt a lot. And when she was in a restaurant, she saw a parent being mean to their kid, and it hurt her.
Right.
It hurt. She went away.
Is that a personality
affected.
thing? Is there what is that?
I do think it's a personality thing. Personally, I think that people have that stronger and less strong. Both empathy and sympathy, which I think are both. I think they're different.
Yeah.
But I guess the ability to feel has a downside to it, and the downside is that sometimes people can get caught up in suffering that's in the world, and they don't. Then they, I think, may connect with symbols of suffering because they don't want a New Year's Eve party. It's not a big, why are you happy when this horrible stuff is happening? And I think some people might feel that more acutely.
Yeah.
So what do you think about them connecting with those death symbols? Do you
well,
think it's different?
I think there's a big difference between someone who is in mourning versus someone who's sort of joyfully turning to symbols of death.
Yes, I agree with you.
As a identifier.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
One's promoting
and they
something.
might overlap on some. And if your
I hear
mourning
you.
goes on too long, there's
Yeah.
a point where it does start to become your identity.
I think that's a good point.
But I mean, so when I posted that, my statement about the culture of death, I immediately had friends who sort of jokingly, one replied that she had just bought these, I think, earrings that were the main character in The Nightmare Before Christmas.
Okay.
Who's a skeleton, more or less, right? It's not exactly that, but and then sort of saying and my reply in jest was like, "How dare you?" Right?
Yeah.
And then my other friend said, "Well, here's our Christmas decorations," and it was a skeleton with the two elf on the shelves sitting on the skeleton's lap. But they both were like, "Well, this was Halloween decorations."
I was just going to say
crossing over. But I also think Halloween is gaining on in as far as significant in our culture.
It is.
Which is another symbol of this celebration of death.
Now, were your friends, do you think they were, was it a way of disagreeing?
Yeah. In a fun way.
In a fun way, yeah.
Right.
But, and not with reasons, not with words, but with,
I did it. Am I a
symbols.
bad guy? Right. And a lot of what Facebook is, and I fall into this sometimes on occasion, I try not to, is it's just a venue for moral outrage. Social media generally can really fall into that. If it's not stoking your ego.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So where would you?
And so they might have interpreted me as saying I was putting out this moral outrage at skeletons in Christmas
So
time.
what would you have wanted? What would be a substantive response you would have? I don't want to say enjoyed, but I'm going to say enjoyed. I don't know what other word.
No, I actually appreciated their responses in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Because if they're willing to stop and even make a joke or make a little,
they acknowledge a point.
That means they're going to think about it.
That's right.
Right.
That's right. That's true.
It's
That's
the people who, I had other people whose comment was very moral in their agreement, moralizing. You know what I mean by moralizing versus discussing morals?
Yeah, I do.
And even though they agreed with me, it felt like, did they really think about it? Or was it just yeah, that's right, and then moved on?
Yeah.
So I would rather the wrestle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think this gets us into a bigger subject, which a lot of these things I think we're going to keep coming back to in different avenues. But this gets back to the larger question, I think, of if we are in a fallen world and we have a world that has corruption, in one sense you could say the world is now defined by death.
Okay. It's under the power of death?
It's under the power of death, yeah. I define by it in multiple ways. One would be under power of it. Two, we have a death sentence in front of us that maybe wasn't intended to be.
Okay.
Right? So we live in the shadow. That's the scripture, right? In the shadow of death. So we have fear. We have anxiety. There's unknown. In other words, death is a major player in our world. Let's give it a personification, and potentially there is personification in the scriptures even.
Well, isn't there a verse about how underlying all fear is the fear of death, or
Yes,
something like that?
yes.
And I always paused
in
at that.
Hebrews,
Is
yeah.
it though?
Yeah.
What was that?
Who
Do you
all
remember
their
what that
days
about?
suffer with fear. He came to redeem and rescue those who all their days have labored under this shadow and fear of death.
Okay.
So I end up thinking what that is that's worldwide. It's fallen nature wide.
Right.
So in that sense, when you start off with the culture of death, you're observing something and lamenting a pathway of loss in our culture.
Well, or you're celebrating it. That seems
Well,
to me...
I know the celebration is the loss, though, is your point. The celebration is the indication that we're losing something as a culture. This is not good.
That's a signal to me that we're losing things.
Something bad is happening.
But what I interpret it, and maybe wrongly, and maybe my friends are trying to get me to see this too, is that what I interpret it to mean is that our hope is not in a resurrection, and that Christ would conquer death, and mourning the fact that our world is broken, but instead sort of accepting with glee that this kingdom that is not of heaven is at work in our life.
I think that's where we have to go. And the step towards that is, it might not necessarily be a bad thing to have the bandage of pretend ripped off of us as people.
Oh, actually encountering death again.
We have death. But that's not the same as glorifying it as a good.
COVID definitely brought that, and I don't know that people have faced. I mean, not as many people died from COVID as it might have
understand.
seemed.
Yeah,
It seems like that would put death at the forefront.
They did,
and push people.
Story-wise, so we could deal.
Well,
with
I mean,
that,
a lot of people are dying still, right?
I know.
I saw.
I think it does have an effect. I don't know what yet. We might be too close, but let's say the Civil War, for example.
Okay.
There was a lot of death in Civil War, but there was a revival, a spiritual awakening that occurred also before and after the Civil War.
Right.
I think
not a great
war
one,
and death, is bigger than we've had in my lifetime.
No, I know, but also produced a lot of like cults and wackiness.
Okay. There's always, John Wesley once said, Lord, bring back the revival. And this time, if you could have, exactly. But if not, bring it anyway.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah. So what I'm just saying though is that maybe death, in other words, this is not true. I'm about to say something that's only partly true, but I was going to say it for shock effect. There is two truths. One is that God wants to make the world better.
Yeah.
And two, God wants to show how bad the world is because we need him.
Right.
And those two things can conflict with one another.
Well, isn't that the difference
to make it better, but then it hides that we need him. So stop making it better, you'll still know that you need him so that he can make it better again.
Isn't that the cycle of blessings and wrath?
It is. It's exactly what it is.
And my understanding, there's a verse I was thinking about, what is it, Romans 1 maybe, where he was talking about that they're getting what their deeds have earned or something.
Yes.
I'm butchering this now. My words are escaping me. But the phrase that I was thinking of...
bigger subject is not something we want to probably talk about today. So
the wrath of God. But the description of that God will not be mocked, you reap what you sow. Mm-hmm. And the idea being that struck me was that maybe all of what we think of as God's wrath is really just that God is keeping those terrible things from happening until we demand that he stop.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes, I know exactly what you're talking about. There is, I think, scripture that supports that idea that blessings can turn into a form of wrath because it's blinding. Mm. If you don't know you have need to be left to yourself, oblivious, if you were given over to a condition you can't feel pain, and you go over and you make yourself a lunch and you don't know that your arm is resting on a hot stove and burning, you don't even know it, that's far worse. That's a severe judgment. Right. Yeah. Well, let's segue into something else because I want to skip down to a second one I was going to do today just because it fits this. Yeah. And that's blessed are those who mourn. Because I've been thinking about that a lot. And so here we have culture of death and it's connected with sorrow. Let me ask you a question real quick. What do you think that means? Blessed are those. How can they be blessed? I mean, if you look at those Beatitudes, blessed are peacemakers, or blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, or, you could list most of them. And they have this element that we can identify as a positive virtue. And if you are pursuing this or in line of this, there's a state of blessedness that comes back upon you in some way. And our minds and hearts say, okay, I get that.
Yeah.
Mourning.
Well, but there's a mixture between the blessings of Matthew and the blessings of Luke, right? So the Sermon on the Mount versus the Sermon on the Plain, I think, is the difference. Okay. So in Luke's blessings, it's mourning and poverty and sickness and struggle. I know
there's yes.
Yeah. So in those cases, I would take it to mean, the what is it called, the Shema? Mm-hmm. The Lord bless you and keep you. Is that the wrong?
No, that's Shema is the Lord.
Oh, that's Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one.
Yeah, Deuteronomy 6.
So in that blessing, maybe it's the Levitical blessing of
the Aarons,
that his face would shine upon you, right, and give you peace. And so the thinking of mine in regard to who's blessed in those Beatitudes is, who is it that God is looking upon with a grace to say, I like you, right? You're kind of a mess, but you're my mess, and I'm going to keep an eye on you and help you. Mm-hmm. And I think people who are struggling in poverty and death, God's tender toward those people in a way that he's not toward the comfortable and the wealthy and I had a great conversation with the pastors that I visit when I go to Sierra Leone, talking to them because they really esteem, so their Christian culture is saturated with the prosperity gospel that says that if you have faith, God will give you wealth. And then they see a lot of Christians from America who obviously have enough wealth to come to Sierra Leone and therefore must be really wealthy. Mm-hmm. So they're Christians. So all Americans to them are either NGOs, like non-government organizations that help with charity, or they're Christian missionaries. So all Americans are good, right? Yeah. And wealthy. And it reinforces the prosperity gospel.
Yeah.
And so I took them to that blessing in Luke. And I said, there's a grace that God has for you guys, because they're one of the 10 poorest countries, I think number 3 in the world.
Yeah.
There's a blessing and a grace that God has for them that he does not have for me. And there's nothing I can do about that. Which is different than just saying, well, I should be humble, right? Or blessed are the poor in spirit. And if you just see your lack, versus that actual, no, it's just blessed are the poor, because God cares about them. Because you've been comforted, you've received it, which is what Luke emphasizes.
Yeah, so that's not the pathway I've gone in my thoughts about it.
That's why we're here.
Yeah,
that's right.
Blessed are those who mourn. What I first began to struggle with was it's a state of blessedness. The first thought was the impulse to say, okay, when we mourn or sorrow, something happens to us. And there's another biblical piece of wisdom that says we learn from it, okay? Right. We learn something good. We receive something in kind that offsets it, and we look back. And so all the days of the locusts or whatever, the days of, the Lord will repay what the locusts have eaten up, okay? And so we say, okay, it's a utilitarian thing. When we mourn, it's because something good will come out of this that we don't see right now. But it's not what the verse says. It doesn't say that.
Right.
I want it to mean that, and that's my first go-to. And I realized that that's not what it said. Then I thought, why do I want to go there? And so I'm looking for a comfort in something good coming out of this. But there's no good that comes out of it. It just says, blessed are you. So the first thing I notice is it states blessed without an outcome. It doesn't even resolve the mourning.
So he's not saying that you will be, like, whatever's causing the mourning will go away.
That's right. That's right. Now, the second thing, what it does say is, for they will be comforted. It doesn't say when they'll be comforted. It doesn't say they'll be comforted soon, or it doesn't say if it's later. So we recognize that there's some element of promise in Scripture that can happen here, but is for sure to be happened there, so to speak, right?
How much of it would be that there's a comfort that God, the Holy Spirit, wants to bestow on us in our mourning, but that we don't hear it because our ears are closed, our eyes are closed? Like open the eyes of our heart kind of question.
And along the same lines, we don't hear it because it's of a nature that we're not thinking. So that's, I think, gets to remember when Jesus says, peace I give to you, not as the world gives peace do I give to you.
Right.
My peace I give to you. And if you reflect on that, you realize, well, what is it, the world's peace? The world's peace is a solution to your problem.
Yeah.
You're
right.
at peace when your problem is fixed.
It's a vacation in the tropics.
It's a resolution of some
freedom
kind.
From debt.
It is the freedom from all the things that could be those problems. My peace I give to you. And his problems aren't resolved. In fact, he gets killed. His problems come to their ultimate end.
Right.
My peace. And so the peace he's giving is of a qualitatively different nature. Mm-hmm. So I do think you're right that we don't hear it sometimes because we're listening for comfort A and it's really comfort B. We talked last week about words and being, it was a safety word of reinvested meanings. Mm-hmm. What is safety? If you disagree with me, I'm unsafe, or if,
Right. It gets redefined as it
gets redefined.
Yeah.
And so I think that we redefine comfort and we redefine words, and therefore we maybe don't hear things. But the thing that I think got me was, in thinking about it, is the improbability or I could not get my mind around the idea that being in a state of mourning is blessed.
Right.
Because it's not.
Well, doesn't the word blessed synonymous with happiness on some level?
I think that's a decent English of it, but it is a little more.
Which makes it feel like an oxymoron.
Yes, and it's even, if we use the word happy, it's probably not, blessed has a better, it's just less good, it's probably a better translation, but I think happy gets us to a shocking point.
Right.
So when we say happy are those who mourn, that's patently false.
Right, obviously.
So how can it be true? Even if there is comfort coming, whether it's tomorrow or in the next life, right. How can it be true, happy are those who mourn? And so I've been thinking about that, and then one night it clicked in my head, one of those 3 a.m, wake up and can't go to sleep thinking about this stuff. And I thought, you know what, I wonder if it is this, that mourning only comes about with a circumstance for us. A circumstance creates it.
Sure.
But then what it does, or it has the capacity to do, is it makes us say this world is broken. And we begin to divest our hope and happiness in the things that are happening to us in the world. And when we do that and we say, because it's broken, it's never going to satisfy, it's never going to do this. And then what we've done is we've realized, and then there's another sorrow that comes in, another mourning, I think. And it is, man, it's messed up.
Right.
Man, this thing wasn't the way it was supposed to be. How sad. And then you start getting wild thoughts, at least I do, thinking, we don't even know what the world was supposed to be. We think this is all normal. Mm-hmm. None of this is normal. And you start going, what would life be without? And then you realize this great grief that what I would say is sin and the fall and corruption, it has wrecked everything and we don't even see it. Right. We're judging it by what we see and think, well, we're close to normal.
Okay, so
we're almost there.
So there's a version of Christianity that wants to build the kingdom of heaven with this hope. I call it modernism, right? That we're going to build an ideal utopian world. And without Christianity, it ends up in communism. But with Christianity, there's this version of like make the world England kind of mentality, right? That we can conquer the world with the kingdom of heaven. But that what I hear you saying is, and I imagine God looking on a world that he made, but that we broke, and saying, even in the brokenness, I have good for you, but it's not yet.
Yes, it does put us in this very difficult place of this tension point between the broken world and what God is mending the world, but it's not complete. I think that's the Hebrews one where it says, he made man a little lower than the angels, and Jesus, but not he put him over everything, but not everything is put under his feet.
Yeah.
And we don't see that, but we see him. And so there's this tension place in which there's a king, but it's not yet completed, this kingdom.
Yeah.
And that's where I end up coming to with blessed are those who mourn, that our circumstances push us into the realm of mourning for the sickness that has engulfed the world, and that we need God.
Yeah.
And in that state, then, I've come back to my senses more closely than before. When I wanted my circumstance mended and the brokenness of my heart mended over this or that thing that was legitimately bad. Now I look back, I'm taken away from that and think, my goodness, the whole thing's broken. How sad. And God, you're the only one who can fix this. And now I enter a state that has some blessedness in it because I actually have hope in the midst of it. And not a single thing was changed in my mourning.
Right.
And I still want the problem that caused me to mourn originally to be fixed. But now it's gone a whole level deeper to mourning over the brokenness of the world. And there's only one who can mend it.
Yeah.
And so that's where I've thought, I wonder if that's what it means. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. In the big sense, everything will get fixed, Mike. Now, this is your little thing. It is sad, and it's something. But this is the one. You look at this, and you look at this picture.
Yeah.
And then that other one shrinks a bit.
So
that's what I was thinking.
That brings me back to the conclusion I drew from that conversation I had around the culture of death.
Yeah.
Because somebody made a good point that we push death too far away, that we isolate our kids from death.
Yes.
And so at the same time, the people who are celebrating death, and maybe this is a caricature in my mind of just people that aren't like me, right? But there's this celebration of death common in culture, or the symbols at least of death. And at the same time, there's this intense, overwhelming fear of actual death in people's response to COVID, for example.
Yeah.
But I think those are the same people.
Yeah.
Strangely enough.
I agree with you.
And I almost wonder if it becomes this pagan totem where I carry this symbol of death
or it's
to
the
try
same
to ward off
philosophy
the death.
that drives them, the same approach that drives them.
Yeah. Right. And so versus if we understand that God made this good world that we broke, and in breaking it, death entered the world, then we would look on death in hope that God is going to fix it in the future.
A little less afraid of it.
And not push it away because it's not so fearful that we need to send anyone dying away to a hospital or a hospice facility.
I agree completely.
But instead, they're in our home. They're part of our family.
And even may embrace it a little bit in that.
And I've sat with multiple relatives near or at death's door and understood this step of faith that's incredible. I remember sitting with my grandfather as a young man. And we were reading Psalms to him as his body lay dying. And it was like, he wasn't him, but he was there, but just barely. And it was my turn to read. We were reading day and night aloud the Psalms. And as I read Psalm after Psalm in whatever section I was in, it was that God had conquered death, was not going to give us over to death. And I could feel him taking this last big step of faith. Like, okay, I put my hope in you, God, and there's nothing I can do now. I'm going to whatever's on the other side of this. Hope in trust, right? That's what real faith is I'm trusting
that's right.
that you're right.
That this
was worth it.
I'll take the leap.
What a beautiful thing.
It is beautiful. However, even in the Christian church, there are people who hate it.
Well, of course they do.
Let's say I was talking with my friends. Well, I'm saying they hate the letting death live close by, in a sense. So I was talking to a friend, and we were in agreement. There would be certain kinds of cancer, if I wouldn't do treatment.
Okay, sure.
Because I think there's very little chance to survive in it. It robs you of what little you have left, and it's okay to die. It's not good. That's not what I'm saying.
Yeah.
It's okay to die. It's going to happen. And if it happens...
So you're adding 12 months of grief and
that's
suffering.
That's exactly right. And maybe for 4 months longer, but then the whole 16 is horrible. I'd rather just have the 12 degrade and have 8 okay and the last 4 be horrible. But there are other people who would get angry about that you're not doing everything you can to preserve life, everything you can to fight.
And they have a Christian, like, we need to stop death.
Yes, exactly.
Isn't that the difference, though, between stopping, let's say, an abortion or infanticide?
I know, I agree.
Versus a 99-year-old who's taking the next logical step.
It's tension points. And I think if you are... Yeah, and that's why I said some cancers, because I think there'd be others that's, if you do this thing, it'll be really uncomfortable, difficult, but you have like an 85% chance that you can get rid of this. It's like, if you refuse that, that's just stupid.
Right.
Right? And they'd be right for them to get mad at you then.
Right.
Right?
Well, because then it almost starts to feel like suicide.
Yes, that's right. That's right, yeah. So,
but there's an ethical question there, and I think all religious people, I would guess, have a tendency to take ethical questions too far, thinking that they're getting closer to godliness.
I know.
So it's like, well, if we are going to stop a sick child from dying. We have to stop everyone from dying forever.
It's just easier to live that way, though. It's not right.
Black and white.
Yes, black and white. Yeah. I've often thought of it as a pendulum. It's just easier to swing right by the middle in the direction that seems right for the moment, and then it's only later you discover, wow, I went too fast.
So there's a theory in education.
So then the guys swing back.
There's a theory in education popularized by a guy named Piaget, and he talks about the developmental stages of the human psyche.
Yeah.
And one of them is moral development, and it happens around age, I think, 14, if I'm remembering right.
Okay.
Where before the age of 14, it's very difficult for kids to think in anything but black and white morality. And
nuance, yeah.
And so what you get is a ton of middle school kids taking on these hyper simplified and radical religion or political philosophies. And so whenever I meet someone whose religion or politics is like that, I think they were converted by a middle school, either a youth pastor or a school teacher.
Yeah.
And they've never thought about it since.
Yeah.
It hasn't matured into, it's sort of like what you're talking about with heroes and villains.
Yeah.
Like, it's one thing to say, well, everybody is flawed.
Yeah.
Right? The hero has his flaws and the villain has his good points.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that is true and makes for a more interesting story. But if you tell that story to 14-year-olds or 12-year-olds, it gets confusing.
Yeah.
But I see it probably the opposite, which is that all of our cultural stories right now are for 12-year-olds. Right? It's Captain America and the Red Skull. It's the ideal. And
but I also think there's a point for that. There's a point, especially with the younger the person is, that the clarity of black and white has its place and role.
Right.
The complexity of gray does need to come later.
But it's not 12-year-olds that are watching the Marvel movies.
Yeah.
It's everybody. Right? And that's where you create this.
Yeah.
That's where you create this idea of like, oh, let's have a nuanced and complex conversation of like about communism or Nazis or, you know, some clear evil or abortion or some of the things that we struggle with in our culture.
Yeah. Well, I sure want to keep going down that, but I want to transition here. I'm going to ask you a question then. You've got some notes on activism and pastors.
Yeah.
What are you thinking?
All right, so I've been exploring Twitter in the last few months.
Okay.
And I follow all these pastors.
What do you mean exploring? Like you're not on it and you just decided?
No, I'm on it. I'm on it. I post some things.
You've just been.
I have like 12
moving around in it.
12 connections. Okay. Right. Nothing.
All right.
Nothing significant. But you can follow. You know, there's millions of people to follow. All the celebrities have, personalities on there, and sometimes they even reply. It's a really fascinating. You said it that community.
Way. They have personalities on there.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
But the celebrity pastors do too. And what I found is I've waded into, and I'm realizing that I got to adjust this camera, so I'm going to pause for a second. And I appreciate that we need to get a man in the chair at some point to run these. What I was seeing is that there are circles of people fighting each other. So there's like a political circle of people not fighting but arguing.
Okay.
And they're arguing not necessarily in a terrible way. Usually they push out the terrible, the personal attacks and the trolling. And they're wrestling with ideas in politics.
Okay.
Or they're wrestling with theology. And there's these different circles and they hardly ever overlap. Okay. And it got me thinking, why do pastors, and I've definitely fallen into this mold, like at any time when I take the pulpit, I feel this boundary. And I don't know if I created it, if I just took it on naturally. The boundary is I only talk about what's in the Bible. And if I apply it to current day, it's only sort of in passing, right? Because this isn't a political conversation. It's a church. Mm-hmm. And then as I've recently also gotten engaged with the local Republican Party. And so they are trying to be activists or have an impact politically. And I think, okay, they're really poorly funded. They're not, everybody has a day job. There's not like this trove of conservative activists who are stirring up and going to school board meetings and protesting. But you do see those people on the other side. And I think, okay, who's funding those people on the other side? Oh, it's these, in
Soros money.
George Soros. I was going to say, there's these names that we pump out.
Yep.
So where's the money from our side? Mm-hmm. We got our billionaires. What are they doing with their money? They're giving it to churches. But the churches have put the boundary up. We don't go out there and fight those fights. We wrestle on theology and church practice and prayer, speaking in tongues, or what other things are. Mm-hmm. And I thought, okay, that seems like a miscalculation. And it came down to this today, actually, I thought, Jesus is Lord of heaven and earth. Mm-hmm. All things have been given to him. Therefore, go and make disciples. Mm-hmm. But if we really believed that, like the political system, Jesus is Lord of that, then as pastors or ministers or just as Christians, we would be his ambassadors in that area. Mm-hmm. Jesus is Lord of our businesses. Mm-hmm. Jesus is Lord. So I got to thinking that if we really believe Jesus is Lord of those things, we would be engaging them as Christians, as his representatives, mm-hmm. instead of just indirectly. Ben Shapiro famously promotes not using religious terms to make political arguments. And there's a place for that if someone's not a Christian and you're saying, well, the Bible says, that might not be so convincing.
Yeah.
But it's still the Bible. It still does say. Mm-hmm. And Jesus still is Lord, mm-hmm. even of those people who, every knee will bow in the mm-hmm. end. And so then my final thought today was, so in any arena that a Christian or a Christian leader or a pastor doesn't address from the pulpit, does that mean it's because he hasn't really put Jesus as Lord of those areas? Mm-hmm. So Jesus is Lord of your marriage. That one's easy. Mm-hmm. Jesus is Lord of your business. Kind of. We're not going to talk about that a lot, right? Mm-hmm. But there's whole books of the Bible called Kings, mm-hmm. like how to be in politics, how to rule, how to be a leader in those arenas. The Bible speaks of it, but we sort of avoid it mm-hmm. because it's all about relationship, which mm-hmm. it isn't. There's mm-hmm. a lot more to life than relationship, even though that's primary. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious of your thoughts.
Well, I'm going to come at it from different than you on this.
I know, I like it.
Pretty sure.
Because you feel that boundary too, don't you?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And not only do I feel it, but I approve of it.
Right.
So there's the reasons that I think that, and I would think I approve of the limitations on pastoral speech, not from a government perspective, but from the individual pastor. Yeah.
Yeah.
And not just self, but I personally think church-wide, kingdom-wide. Mm. And it's because the dynamics of Jesus' kingdom are not the same as the dynamics of the kingdoms of the world. Okay. The weapons of their warfare are not activism. Right. It's not voting. It's not any of
But isn't it evangelism? Isn't that a spiritual weapon?
It is.
So what's the difference between, does evangelism have to be a direct appeal about the gospel, or can it be an appeal to turn from the sin and promotion of homosexual behavior in the public sphere? Do you know what I'm saying? Because that's all politics.
Yeah. So I think that it is an appeal to good news, though it can be through several different avenues. It's always an appeal to good news.
Right.
But it doesn't always, it can come through in my opinion, it can come through various ways. So let's say abortion, for example. I think it's appropriate as a pastor to talk about it as because of life and the sixth commandment and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I was never in support of having literature out about it as a part of the church. I was never in support of the church advocating for a pro-life march or a pro-life support of a pro-life candidate or any of those things, because that's not the weapons of the church. The weapons of the church, or let me go further on, not the weapons of the church, the realm of the church's authority is not in the realm of government. Even though it can speak about governments, it's not their realm.
So how does Jesus establish his authority in those places if he's Lord of the political sphere?
So I'll say two comments on that. One, he has no interest in establishing his authority in those places, except he has an interest in his people going in and spreading their influence as light and salt kind of thing.
So how is that different from what I'm saying?
Because I think that it's not trying to, I don't think Jesus is trying to take over the governments of the world. I think he's
I distinguish it as I don't want the institutions of the church to begin controlling the institutions of government.
Right.
But I want everyone at church to go influence the institutions of government.
Okay, and
is that
so
what you're saying?
With this definition or caveat, I agree with that as individuals.
Correct.
Not as church representatives.
So when candidates say, I'm a Christian.
Great. If they have a calling as a Christian to go and be a politician, great.
Yeah.
But it's not my calling, and it may not be my wife's calling. And I can't use, if I'm a pastor, the power of the church to say, well, my wife should have that calling. Or my wife, I think I can say to...
Wait, I'm lost on the wife part. What does it mean?
Okay, if my wife is a teacher, let's say a grade school teacher, she's called to do so as a Christian in the best way effectively she can, but she's not called to be an evangelist as a teacher. She's not called, she's there to teach kids, not to make them Christians.
Okay.
I think the same way a politician, somebody says they're a Christian and they go to my church and they want to be in politics, great. Go and be a Christian as a politician. That's your individual calling.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that the rest of the church should go be politicians with you.
Right.
As a pastor then, I think the pastor's unique job is actually I think it's actually apolitical because
if one political party is promoting genital mutilation of children, abortion, homosexual behavior, like all the things that are against God's word,
then
you're saying a pastor shouldn't say avoid that movement, that political party?
Yes, I would say you should. I don't think they should say avoid that party. I think
would a pastor say avoid this movie because it promotes those things?
No, I would. I don't even think that. I don't think it as a pastor. I should tell you a particular thing to do or not do, other than don't do a moral wrong. Like I think I can tell you don't kill somebody, but I don't think I can tell you not to be neighbors with your friend if you think he killed somebody. Not to be friendly with your neighbor.
Not to be
if. I could tell somebody don't kill somebody, but if they go to watch a movie, now if I was talking to them, I think there's a principle that corruption, there is corruption, and it will seep, and it's trying to destroy you. You need to exercise caution.
So then, what about? I'm inching toward the extreme to see if there's a boundary, right?
Yeah, go.
So, could a pastor say, "Don't look at pornography"?
We have to talk about what pornography means, but yes, I think so, because I think it's a direct moral wrong.
Oh, okay.
So we know there's a wide range there. I mean, we just take soft, medium, and hard pornography, right? And soft pornography, you have to be careful that you end up. There are some people say don't go to a beach.
Well,
literally, there are pastors that say that you should not go to the beach because they all
I'll
dress.
Give you a more relevant. Because I've never heard anyone say that, but I can hear him. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I had a lot of friends, Christians,
and they would call it pornography.
Churchgoers. But do we have to listen to those people?
but their point is that it's not a clear boundary of where it starts and stops. So I think it is clear.
There's the "you know when you see it" classic line, right? But so here's my example. All right. So when Game of Thrones was on, a lot of Christians that I knew, churchgoers, would ask if I'd been watching it, and I wasn't, and I said, well, the amount of incestuous rape in my life is currently at its ideal level of 0. I don't really need any more, and it sort of ended the conversation. But it's like that show was by its design, like I've seen interviews with the creators, to be titillating toward every kind of corrupt. Sexual and violent deviancy that you can imagine.
Yeah.
So it's got a great story, all the things that people say.
Yeah. So then what about Amistad? Did you watch Amistad?
Yeah.
Okay, there's nudity in that.
Well, nudity's not the problem.
I know, I agree with you, but we're agreeing right now on a subjective language thing. We just said one is nudity and we're going to say the other is pornographic.
Right.
And you and I agree on these two examples.
Right.
But we're also then acknowledging that there is a subjective level of we think one is in one category and one is in the other. There would be other people who would disagree with you and I.
But what I'm trying to get to is the debate in question is what are the areas where you would say yes or no in how someone conducts their business or votes in the election.
Okay, so let's get back. Let's take what you just said there. Let's get back. And what's his name in I want to say Witherspoon, but in England, who stood against slavery for 40 years before it got passed.
Yeah, I'll think of it while you.
Yeah, him. I think that was an excellent thing he did.
Right.
But he's doing that as an individual Christian. I don't believe it was the church's job as an institution to do that.
To preach against slavery?
No, I didn't say preach. To go and fight and try to get a legislative and to actually have it overturned.
Okay, but part of how this conversation started is the boundary I feel when I enter the pulpit around issues like that. Like in the day, slavery would have been a thing. Mm-hmm. How many pastors were celebrated in 2020 promoting critical race theory and the ideas around neo-Marxism, but saying this is a moral imperative. This is how you love your neighbor.
Yeah, I disagree with them for that. I don't think that was right. So, I'll just cut to the chase on a couple of things that I thought when I was pastoring.
Yeah.
I didn't want a U.S. flag on the stage.
Right.
I didn't want a Christian flag. I didn't want literature.
Why? What would a Christian flag? Why would that matter? What does it even mean?
I thought that it was a part of a cultural expression from the 50s that was no longer relevant to where we were culturally.
But I mean, what's the meaning? I don't even understand. I've seen the Christian flags growing up. I never knew what they were trying to do except say.
Well, I think it was from an era when flag was loyalty.
Okay.
In a way that we don't feel.
So what are they saying they're loyal to? Christendom.
Yeah, Christendom. Yeah.
Okay. So what's wrong with Christendom?
Nothing's wrong with Christendom as a thing, but it's not. I don't think it's the Okay, let me back up. Yeah. I can say this. I think Christendom is a caricature. I think Christendom. You could say Christendom is that expression of the church that has death has entered it, and it's become structural and inorganic. It's like coral. You know, they say like 15% of coral is living and 85% is dead.
Right.
I mean, that's how it lives. But it's a nice illustration. Well,
you don't even like coral now, huh?
I like coral. But and then you get theological about it, and you have this idea of the kingdom and the church, and they're not the same. Right. The church is an earth-oriented expression of kingdom, and it's a God-approved one, but there's places where there's no life.
So would you say
kingdom is only life?
Would you say, going back to the political activism, right? Mm-hmm. Would you say there is no government structure that is more godly than another?
Say that again.
Is there a political system that's more biblical or godly than
another? I do think, yes. I think there's ones that align themselves with more things that are good that God says are good.
So in theory, you could have Christian communism. Not really, but let's just say authoritarian. The whole spectrum. You could have Christian authoritarianism.
I mean, they all have virtue in them.
Right.
But they all have various levels, and some have more and some have others. So even communists, they don't survive unless there's some organization. And organization is a gift from God. There has to be, so all governments work only because they're stealing a little bit from God, good things. Some have more good things. I mean, I do think our founding country was at a pinnacle high point. But there's been other good Christians who would say monarchies are the best expression of God, of government.
Because Jesus is king, man.
Because God rules as a king. But that's anyway. But so let's get back to the abortion one. So for example, on the Right to Life Day,
you don't want political activism as a requirement for membership.
And here's why. Because the church is more than that. And what I wanted as a pastor, when I was pastoring, is that the church is a place where you could be left or right, and you could come to hear a message about something bigger than that.
Right, but if you're on the left now, that means you're participating in, or at least accepting and promoting.
Yeah.
In
name a bad
totally immoral behaviors.
Just let's say
sodomy.
Okay.
I saw a video. It was like in a mall in Dubai, right? I don't know if it was Dubai. It might have been Kuwait. Who knows? But there were some U.S. servicemen walking through this mall, and somebody comes up with their phone and says, "Are you guys Americans?" And they're like, "Yeah." And he says, "Are you here to export sodomy?" And I said, "What?" I go, "This is America's number one export. Is sodomy. Are you here to export sodomy?"
Yeah.
And they sort of like, "No, man," and they kind of walked off. But you could see even on the army guys' faces, yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do.
So how could you say you're in right standing with God and you promote sodomy?
Okay, because I don't think it's the church's goal to make the world morally better. I think it is
the government's job, right?
No. I think it's individual Christians.
Evil, servant of God?
Okay, that's fine. I agree with that. By the way, that came up last time, and I think we shot past each other on that one. But and I didn't catch it until I watched the second time. But no, so I think that when you have something that has become politicized, like abortion, let's say, where it is a part of the Democrat platform, it's not a part of the Republican platform.
Right.
As soon as you join into it as a political activist, if you're a pastor, you have lost the power of the church, in my opinion. And you have joined the political structures of power.
Right.
And you're on the right now. And now if you're on the left person and their life is in a shambles and they believe in abortion and they believe for whatever reasons, so I'm also politically right of center, but when I was pastoring, I unpoliticized myself when I interacted with people. Nothing political in my opinion.
So you would never, as a pastor, from the pulpit say to people who are teachers in the public school that there's a lot of other teachers or counselors or administrators promoting and supporting kids to be transition against the will of their parents in their gender, right?
Okay.
I say in quotes.
Okay, yeah.
So that's something to me I would say is a clear moral imperative.
I think it's a moral evil also.
Right.
But I would not preach on that topic alone. No. I would, if that came up, I would say it, and I would maybe even have it strategically brought up. But
how does not preaching on the topic make it?
But if if it did come up in a topic, here's what I would also do.
Yeah.
I would put a moral evil that the right does.
And how come?
Because as a pastor, my job is not to take a side. My job is that any soul that walks in, no matter their political position, they have an opportunity potentially to hear a word of life, to be turned from what they are doing wrong to God. And if I say...
okay, I struggle with that. Based on how you're saying it, I think we might agree more than we realize. But
the church can't be the right.
If some guy is sleeping with his girlfriend or shacked up with her, you could make the same argument. I don't want to say anything that would cause him to not hear the message.
No, I think that's not the same.
Because the message from that setting is you need to repent from this immoral thing, and in so doing, come back to God.
Well, if that topic had been politicized, then I would be careful to say it.
So why is politics this uniquely kept?
Because politics, and it isn't just politics, but it is. It could be economic issues. Economics can function the same way. It turns off if you align yourself with a camp on an issue. If you allow yourself to be put in a camp, you have defanged, you have unauthorized yourself from being heard. Because now you're a part of a camp, and if you're in the other camp, I don't hear you. Because you're in that camp.
What I've said actually from the pulpit is I don't think Jesus would be a Republican, because he doesn't entrust himself to any man. Right? He doesn't join your movement. You get to join his movement. But that doesn't mean that many people who follow Jesus wouldn't be Republicans.
I agree
of course
with that.
They would be, right?
And we have to say many are Democrats also.
But that's where I think I could say that 10 years ago. I don't think I could say it today.
Okay, I know what you mean when you say it that way, and I have some agreement, and we're so far over time.
I wanted to show you this. Can I show you this really quick?
Yes.
So this is, I'm going to show our audience too. This is our church, okay? And this is a slideshow we made about how we want to structure our leadership. And within the church is all of the ministries that are active. Okay. But what we did is mention in passing of this presentation, this larger, so if you see there all the ministries in the center, this is the church, but then this outer ring, I called it a vision for the people of the church going beyond the walls of the institution. I mean, we don't even have a building, so there's no actual walls, to have influence in all these other areas. Maybe as ministries of the church, or at least as the church being a training ground for supporting local nonprofits or foster care, or how do we support people on the street or in addiction or just in severe poverty, but also having influence in politics. And so my thinking is that Jesus, the gospel applies to every facet of society.
I agree with that.
And so
But through which vehicle?
As disciple makers, we want to disciple people to be godly in all those areas, but not as a representative of the church, like of Grace, our church, but as Christians. I think that's what you're saying too.
I am.
Yeah.
So when you said we, that's where I would differ. It depends on what the we means. I don't think it's the church's job to be political. I think it's individual Christians. Mm-hmm. Some of them are going to be called to be political. Some have different callings. You have lots of things up there, fostering kids or whatever.
Right.
But, and I think I make a distinction there. The church's job is to train Christians to do their job. The church, in one sense, you could say this: the church is a nothing. It is only its people, and so its job is to train its people to go out and be salt and light in the ways that they are gifted and God calls them to be.
But if someone said, "Could we do a Sunday school class on how to run a small business?" Mm-hmm. Would you say no to that?
A Sunday school class on how to run a small business, probably.
Probably you would say no?
Yeah, I probably would not, because
just that it's not quite
about
what we're about. What if it was just like, because here's the other thing.
Ethics for small business leaders? Sure.
Ethics, right. Here's a big thing I'm a fan of, is that I think Christians too often are trained to ask for permission from their pastor to do anything.
I mean, I agree. That's a different question.
But, well, I think that's
maybe you're
what's
saying
happening.
It roots out
like,
of this one.
Why do you need a Sunday school class to do small business? Why don't you just do it? I mean, an announcement about it might be helpful. Mm-hmm. But does the church make announcements for organizations that are not the church?
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
So I was in a church once, and there was a bunch of people in the church who were behind a private school, a Christian school, Christian class school, and they wanted to put a sign on the church's property because it was a big thoroughfare. Yeah. And I said no, and it made a lot of people mad. Mm-hmm. And the reason I said no is the church is not about one school over another, even if we have a majority agreement with this school and a minority agreement with that school. Our job is not to promote that school over this one.
But you work for a church that had a school.
I know, yeah.
So how does that square?
I didn't agree with how that was structured. I would never agreed that the church should have been under the school and controlled like that.
So just separate organizations.
I think it should have been separate.
Interesting.
And when you join something that has already had 50 years of history, that's not
and it's not necessarily the first thing you need to be working toward reforming if you're in that position.
Yeah.
Cool.
Well, we'll have to do this again. Bring
we're out of time.
This subject up. Yeah. So we're out of time. And,
best insight. Today I felt like we wrestled with a lot more than we have so far. I like it. Mm-hmm. What do you think?
Best insight. This might be harder. This might not be the best off ramp, because now my brain is saying insight. Think.
Yeah.
I like the Handmaid's Tale. I thought that was insightful with the rights of reproduction. It was a great illustration of what I see in a number other of realms, and I had never thought about that one. It is yet another accusation that reveals what machinations are in your own heart.
Yeah. Cool. I was interested in our conversation on sorrow and how it ties into the fear that it's really common going on right now. There are so many people struggling. And I think a lot of Christian ministry seems focused on a type of comfort that feels really shallow.
Yes, I agree with that.
That says go around the sorrow because that's where the hope
Learn
is.
something from it, or
versus
see something,
there's hope in the sorrow.
Yes, exactly. That it is itself putting you in a place that has blessedness in it.
All right. Yeah. So here's a question, final question.
Yeah.
Unless you have more. And that is, are we ready to post this? Are we ready to ask people to follow? I mean, this is our episode 4, right?
We're really bad at time management. But of course, we have to let things go where they went. And I didn't feel like we pushed anything. It just went where it went today.
Yeah.
The other thing we didn't do today, this is Christmas. We didn't say anything.
And not to mention, it's your 30th anniversary today, and you're late for your date.
Is it?
It's 2:33.
Oh, yeah, I got to roll.
Yeah, you got to go. All right. So if you're still with us, we appreciate you. And I'm going to post this unless Mike tells me not to.
No, we're not gonna post till January.
That's right. That's right. But it doesn't mean we won't post this one.
That's right.
But if you're seeing this one, we appreciate you, and we'd love it if you'd share this out.
We might dump the first time, like
and send
have
us
a
questions.
live.
Yeah, it'd be fun to start out with a few episodes, even in the very beginning.
Frankly, if we did post a few, we could always post the first ones and just say that people have the opportunity to say, "Wow, okay, I'm glad they
get to binge a little bit.
Glad they learned or whatever."
Right.
Yeah.
They can see our progression.
Yeah,
all right.
Hopefully.
All right. Well, everybody, Merry Christmas and Happy New Year.
Amen.
All right. We're out.